Okay, here we are with the Datsun. Just recently moved in from the outdoors, the freezing outdoors. After she's had a chance to defrost a bit, we'll go over this build. Very basically, it's a 70 Datsun pickup. I suppose they were only regular cabs, but regular cab, regular bed. Projects, meaning that it's running, actually operable. It's not in the middle of being worked on. It's a 70 Datsun pickup. Pretty rough. You know, I'm more a fan of making them go than making them look pretty, which is fairly obvious. Looking at this thing, it was obviously just the smallest pickup I could find. That was the idea behind it, was the small vehicle, large engine combination. This engine here is actually the original crate motor that I bought for the Fury back when that was the plan, was to drop crate motor in the Fury, but that never happened, so the engine hung around, and I actually dropped it in a couple other vehicles over the years. The last one that it was in was a 96 Mazda B2300, little two-wheel drive pickup that was, as small as they are, it was still actually fairly heavy, right around 3,600 pounds. So while it moved, it wasn't quite as quick as this would be with the same setup. Now, most of the V8 swaps that I'd seen on Datsun forums and YouTube videos had the engine just crammed up against the core support here, and the radiator usually ended up being in the bed, kind of cobbled together. I entertained the idea of actually making this little pickup handle well, so I wanted to get a decent setback on the engine and not have to remote mount the radiator. So in order to make that happen, a large chunk of the firewall had to come out, and you can actually see, if I get my drop light here, just how far back in there the motor actually sits. This is the old firewall, the extent of the old firewall, and we are actually the rearmost exhaust port is inside the cab of the car and actually goes along the firewall and up and out this way. Because this steering shaft is a one-piece unit, I'm sure it could be modified, but it also lends to the stiffness where it goes through the firewall. Otherwise there wouldn't be enough, not nearly enough support for it. So I left it with the one-piece tube that it is, and therefore I had to make a header that avoided all that. There wasn't really enough room to go down and back on this side. I suppose I could have gone through the fire or the inner fender, but there's not a whole lot of room in there either, with as big as the wheels are I've got on this. So I had to get a little creative, and she obviously sweeps up and around, straight down through there, and then back to join the rest of the exhaust. It was just a sprint car weld up header kit with a bunch of random bends and the flanges and collector. So I just started mocking it up and cutting and pasting. The other side is drastically shorter, and may actually lead to a restriction in the exhaust, but it was kind of all I could manage. So you can see the real sharp downturn, and then it just heads straight back alongside the motor. And actually, forced me to make the transmission tunnel much larger, obviously, on this side than the other there. That collector actually comes back right in here. The collector's here, and then it's got a 90-degree turn, and it rolls down between the transmission itself and the torsion bar that runs down through there. We'll get back into this interior after a second with some more of the details, but so originally a 380 horse crate motor. I drove it for a while in that configuration, and then RHS and Indy, I guess, teamed up to produce this. They call it the X-Head. It's still cast iron, but it flows a lot better than what were basically 360 truck heads. This crate motor itself is by and large just a mid-90s or late 90s pickup truck block. The rotating assembly, pistons, and everything are just basically what would come on a stock truck. 9-to-1 compression. The only thing that really jacks up the horsepower is a cam that is quite large and this single plane intake. So all that's the same. I swapped out the heads, and it's made a difference of maybe 70 horsepower on the dyno anyways. And then for the longest time I just had an old Edelbrock 750, mechanical secondary, real simple carburetor on there, but once I threw it in here, decided I might as well join the 21st century, and that's just another Holley Sniper throttle body fuel injection. The brakes I had to get a little creative with, obviously, because everything is so busy over here. Getting the master cylinder and then the clutch master cylinder to all fit in the same place and not burn up when it's running. They get warm, but with this heat shielding, I haven't noticed any melting. And I made sure to get, instead of plastic reservoirs mounted to the body themselves, metal bodies with remote mount reservoirs. Just the biggest radiator I could find that was going to fit, within the confines of the truck itself. I ended up cutting out the core support just in order to swing the motor in when I was installing it, and I haven't gone as far as cutting a hood to fit everything, so this may get a little rework in the future. One thing I am fairly proud of, I guess, was, well, the size of the wheels. They're 19 by 9 Inkies, and basically the reason I chose them was they were about the first wheel that I came across that had a high enough offset to keep the wheel inside the wheel well here. You can see there's a little bit of rubbing going on there at full lock, but you avoid extreme turns and you're okay. One thing I was able to do, a lot of the Datsun forums, when you go to looking for disc brake swaps for this truck, because it was originally a four-wheel drum truck, a lot of their main solutions or ways of getting a disc brake on here is to actually swap the kingpin and the steering knuckle for a later, I believe either a 620 or 720, which is just a later body style of Datsun pickup. Swap that out and you can get the disc brakes to go with them, but you're also stuck with their, it's like a 6 on 5.5 bolt pattern, which limits you quite a bit as far as selection of wheels. I was able to just mic out the bearing races on the existing knuckle, steering knuckle, and then cross-referencing it with what was in this hub here, which is just a Willwood hub. And I actually bought a different bearing that had a different ID on the bearing race and was able to use it inside this hub. And then from there I was able to go through Willwood's catalog and get the correct parts in order to have a pretty slick disc brake set up on the front. The mount, let's see here. The mount itself I fabricated out of just 3/8 steel. Took the old backing plate from the drum brake, just measured out where the bolts were on it, and the offset or the distance I needed to get the caliper to clear the disc, and that all came together fairly well. It's not a floating caliper, so there are some shims back here to get it centered on the disc itself, but I was kind of happy with that. Still running the stock little guy sway bar. We might upgrade that in the future, but for right now that's the way it's going to be. So here we are in the cockpit of the Datsun. First off, we've got all of our electronics, such as they are: ignition, fuel pump, charging system, headlights, blinkers are all on this handy little panel right here with a little push button starter. We've got a brake bias controller there because there wasn't any room in the engine compartment anymore. If you look up close there, you can see that exhaust runner that had to be inside the cab. I don't get a whole lot of leakage from that V-band, so that's cool. And I keep the windows open anyways because it gets hot in here. I had to cut a recess in the back of both of my brake and clutch pedals in order to go around the pipe there, so that I welded some gussets on the side of there. One of the big pains is the fact that both these pedals are so close together. When you're trying to run them both, these big old boots, they get in the way, but I've managed it. The engine is actually set far enough back to where my gas pedal is actually mounted on the back of the bell housing, the scatter shield on the back of the bell housing there, and then obviously runs through to the throttle body. Still got well, when I pulled the engine out, it had a little short piece of tubing for the oil pressure sender, so I figured I'd just mount the oil pressure gauge there. Got my big tack, as is always required in race car. The transmission is just an old school A833. It'd be the same transmission you'd find in old school Mopar manual cars. It's just a 4-speed non-overdrive transmission. It's held up pretty well. No complaints to speak of. Our transmission tunnel, as you can see, is pretty ugly. I just kind of started putting pieces in and adding pieces where they should go and keeping enough space so that I got room for my boots and most people who would sit in the car. Our little display for the EFI. Somebody liked this truck back in the day and went as far as putting a sunroof in it. I don't run with it open because I'm not sure how secure it is, and I'd rather not lose that at extra legal speeds. Obviously our dash is gone. At some time in the future I may need to modify that and put it back in because it is a requirement in certain racing classes. That, and I inadvertently blocked my wipers, the mechanism, from moving around, so that'll have to be clearanced and sealed back up. You can see the rest of my exposed wiring, the little Kirky drag racing seats. I haven't elected to buy the pad that you can get for these, but it's really not as uncomfortable as it may look. It is a bit of a chore getting in and out of here, but that's to be expected. This sweet little thing was on there when I bought it, and despite it being, what, 12-inch steering wheel, the vehicle actually steers fairly well with little resistance. The front of the truck's jacked up right now, so it looks like it's super easy, but with 295 tires up front and all the extra weight of that motor, you can still steer one-handed as long as you're rolling. Alright, so here we are at the back end of the Datsun. Obviously this bed has seen better days with some extra holes and signs of having been used at some point. My hinge is a little distressed, allowing this back portion of the tailgate itself to be pushed out, but eventually we'll fix that. I made a simple little roll pan for it, and recessed a section for the plates. Otherwise, most of these old Datsuns have just kind of an ugly diamond plate tail or bumper on them, which don't necessarily add to the look very much, and the tail lights themselves are pretty ugly. So these little guys here are my tail lights, blinkers, brake lights. They're just actually some stick-on little guys that I got out of Summit, and they're wired up. Let's see, I think my running lights are all 4. Brake lights are the centers, and the blinkers are the outsides. So fills the legal requirement. My little license plate light here is just a little LED guy. Fairly simple. And we'll crawl underneath here and look at the good stuff. Obviously, it's not painted, but this is obviously a competition engineering fabricated 49-inch rear end. You can't see the best stuff, which is Curry third member with I forget which type of limited slip differential, 325 gear, because that's as tall as they sell this drop-in third member. It's an aluminum piece, and was just a whole lot simpler than piecing together all the parts and assembling them. Plus, they do the assembly, backlash and clearancing as far as the ring and pinion goes. So it's kind of a money ahead, time ahead type of deal. This will eventually be my drive shaft loop. I have to finish the top side of it, but you can see the framework that I've got going on here is attached in a couple places to the old frame because I tried, well, my initial attempt was just way too flimsy, so I had to beef it up some. So I've got actually 3 connections, one here with a straight across bar, that there, and then these diagonals that run up forward. They aren't all welded out on the bottom sides because I have a hard time with the overhead welding. I can get it to stick sometimes, and then sometimes it just rains down molten metal on my face. So eventually I'll take this thing down and lay the frame itself on its side and finish all these welds. But for the time being, for my purposes, it is suitable. These little shocks in the back here were about the only thing I could find that was short enough to allow me to mount in the stock location, and then at some point obviously on the frame here. Yeah, they're little short guys, and with this spring pack on the Datsun itself, this truck was actually rated back in the day as a half-ton, so that probably has a lot to do with this big basically an overload spring here. But even still, she rides like a buggy, just real stiff. So you can see our Willwoods here. They're the same diameter as the front, 12-inch with a 4-pot piston. Just a regular old kit to bolt to a, what was it, 4-9-inch with the, they just say, they call it a large bolt pattern. For that, I still have some dialing in to do with the brake bias adjuster in order to get an ideal front to rear brake bias. But you can see some of our other structural members here where I relocated the springs to. These here aren't a whole lot higher, but the fronts are quite a bit higher. You can see where I rolled them up, and then they're quite a bit more inboard. The original mount was where you can see that cut off the frame there, and they were in line with it actually. So we're probably center to center, about 3.5 or 4 inches inboard of the stock location. But yeah, you can see our exhaust here, good size 3.5-inch exhaust. It's a little bit more than is required to allow the engine to breathe, but the collectors that I bought with the weld up kit were just that big, so I figured I'd take it 3.5 inches all the way out the back. These little drag mufflers, they're I mainly bought them just for the turn downs on them, 45-degree turnout. They don't quiet much down, so you get the full effect. And the last thing we'll look at is not the entire fuel system, but the fuel tank and battery box. Nothing special there. There just wasn't a whole lot of room in the engine compartment, so might as well move it to the back. You can see just how much I tubbed the rear here. I think it ended up being about 4.5 inches. But this keg I had kicking around the house for years and years, and had planned on using it on another project, but this one came along first, so she went in there. It's just got a fitting welded to the bottom of the tank. It's a stainless fitting with just a ball valve so that it can be shut off without draining the whole thing. She fills through the old tap here, if I can get it out. Oh, there it is. Just took the standpipe and kind of most of the guts out of there. So it sits in there loose enough so that you don't build up too much pressure. Secured by these handy little hooks and a chain with a little baby chain binder, so she isn't going anywhere. Right now I have the engine that's going to go in my Regal exploded all across the back of the truck right now, so that will have to get fixed before we get into the rest of the Datsun build here. And as always, the trusty fire extinguisher. This one actually rides around in the back of the truck because you never know when a project like this, especially a project like this, is going to cause you heartache.